Ratish has extensive experience in conceptualizing and implementing strategic large-scale solutions for social impact. At Satwa, Ratish leads the nonprofit advisory practice, where he works very closely with nonprofit organizations that have the potential to impact 1 million people to achieve orbit shifting change. He has contributed at governmental policy level in education and skill development. Ratish has also spent a decade working at SAP across their engineering, product management, and corporate strategy divisions. He is a graduate from BITS Pilani and is here with us today to share a perspective on how nonprofits are responding to the crisis and what is it that they should be doing to be responding to the crisis. Over to you, Ratish.
Hi, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So hello everyone. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to all of you. I had a chance to see the participant list, a lot of familiar names. So it's good to be back among friends in times like these. The conversation for today is how are NGOs responding to COVID-19. Just to give you a background about us as an organization, we are a consulting organization with an exclusive focus on social impact. We work with nonprofits, foundations, and CSRs in designing and implementing scalable social programs on the ground. We also work extensively with nonprofit organizations over the last 10 years in enabling them to scale their impact on the ground. Yeah, the work that we do broadly falls under 4 categories, and I'll share with you why I'm sharing this introduction. One is in working with donors and advising them on where to invest and managing that capital for them. The second part of our work really is in working with nonprofits and building their capability through a hands-on approach. Third is in conducting research, which is on-ground data-led research, and also curating existing public data sets to be more actionable. And the last part is where Tatva designs and pilot solutions on the ground that we think is scalable. And in the light of the COVID crisis, we've been doing all of these 4 things, which is really on the basis of which this presentation's been done. We've been talking to nonprofit organizations to understand what programs they may have for immediate relief that we can connect to CSRs and other foundations and possibly even government. So that I think has given us a database of the work that organizations are doing. We've been in touch with a lot of our customers, organizations that we've worked with, in order to understand what they're already doing, support them in the work that they're already doing, and also in discussing with them how they could approach such a crisis. So for example, we are setting up a program management office for a large-scale implementation of community health with one of our nonprofit clients already. We are in discussions with another organization which is in the healthcare space that's now getting a lot of attention from corporates and needs support in implementation. So we're doing that. In addition to that, talking to nonprofits. That's the other source of information. We've also been putting together a public dashboard around the data that we are collecting around COVID in terms of what is happening in the broader ecosystem. I've taken some examples there as well. And lastly, we are talking to nonprofit organizations today to see what we can do beyond the immediate relief, which has a more intermediate or a long-term focus as well. And a lot of ideas around strengthening the healthcare network, enabling livelihood opportunities, etc. And what I would like to do today in the next about 40 minutes is to be able to share with you what we are learning from the ground. I've categorized it into a framework, but I'd love to make it as many examples as possible. Some of these examples are not named because those organizations might not want to share their names at the moment, but most of them are credited details. One thing that I truly believe is that the wisdom is actually in the crowds more than me, right? So one of the things I would suggest as a suggestion from my side as the session's going on is if participants in this webinar or in this workshop can share things that you are doing in your organization as part of the chat as well, and especially areas that I'm highlighting. I think it'll be a great way for the organizations in the webinar to learn from each other. And I'm sure the Atma team and the rest, we can curate that a lot more effectively for greater value later. I'm sure a lot of people have spoken about this, but I just want to lay it out. That this particular crisis is not a blip in our current operations. I've been in touch with some of the largest foundations, in India. I've been talking to them over the weekend as well. A lot of them are making significant changes to their grant portfolios and to their funding strategies overall. In the entire thinking globally, both in the international offices and in the Indian offices of foundations, is to not spend all the money that they have on immediate relief, because they have a feeling that this might continue for a fairly long time. I don't know how many of you have seen this recent presentation that has been leaked, which says that a potential lockdown might have to continue for till September. Yeah. So that is one. So there is going to be a long-term impact on the sector and on the funding. Second is, this is not just a social sector crisis. This is something that has an economic, political, and a social ramification. So solutions that we will come up with as an organization or as a sector has to keep in mind how the various aspects of this can be considered rather than just a social lens of this. And especially in areas like livelihood, I think keeping in mind the reality of the business, reality of politics, and the reality of society, I think is going to be critical. Thirdly, I think I've talked about it, there will be significant changes in funding. But at the same time, and what I'm seeing in the social sector is that there is also an opportunity for organizations to reassess their role. I'm actually seeing organizations taking up programs that are actually not the regular programs that they run. Because some of the entrepreneurs and social leaders that I'm talking to, and I'll give more examples as we go along, are saying maybe this is an opportunity for us to scale and diversify the work that we are doing, not just immediate term, but also midterm and long term. And that essentially is also where the next point comes in, which is, as any nonprofit leader or as a person in the social impact ecosystem, I think the critical question that we have to ask ourselves at the leadership level is, how much do I want to change the work that I'm doing going forward? How much do I want to pivot? Should I just mitigate this crisis? Should I just adapt to this crisis? Or am I going to make deep-rooted changes to the reality that we are facing with, which I think is going to be an important question. Another important thing that we are operating with internally at Sattva, and it's something that's coming up in all our conversations also, is that anyone who tells you this is what you should be doing now is bluffing, right? Me included. So I think there is really only guidelines at the moment. I think all of us are understanding what this reality means for us. And honestly, everything that I suggest today is something that I would say is that, that resonates with us as an idea that makes sense. But there is really no way that any of us can say that this is the way we should approach this crisis, because I don't think in our generation, we have faced with something like this for us to make clear rules on how to go forward. And hence, the greatest strength is going to be agility. Is going to be able to say that we will not know what to do 5 days from now, but we should know what we have to do today and be willing to change our minds going forward. And I think the more we create ways to learn from each other and stay connected, I think the better the value is going to be. Yeah. So I think these are things that I just wanted to leave, because this forms the context of the presentation as well that you will see. And as we are looking at, the experience, at Sattva, we categorize that into 3 groups of organizations take up. One is what we call mitigate. Really, there are immediate risks for people, for operations, financially, and purely from the model of being, defensive at the moment. What can you do to ensure safety and being of the organization and the staff? How do we make sure that everyone gets out of this alive and well is really one response. The second is from the perspective of, given this is what everybody is talking about right now, how do we adapt in a way where we don't change what we are doing dramatically? There's no significant shift in what we are doing, but what are these minor tweaks in the way we are engaging with people, running our operations that will make sure that we stay relevant in the current conversation. And the third is pivot, which is this may mean an opportunity to do something maybe that you've always wanted, or you assume that your reality is going to look like this 12 to 24 months from now. So what can you do to, take that shift and move forward? Just to give quick examples in each of these, and I have more detailed examples coming. Mitigate is a classic example where one of the CEOs I spoke to started looking at their financial planning and said, what are all the costs that for me are nice to have costs, and how do I create a way in which I can reduce some of those costs going forward? How do I set up employee all hands on a regular basis so that my employees are feeling well? So that's really mitigate. Adapt is I was talking to an entrepreneur working in the climate change space. And the first question that the person brought up was, how do we discuss climate change in the time of COVID? Is that even relevant? Because a lot of what we are doing, a conference of 437 people running online, is something that saves a lot of travel for all of us. So is that something that we should do more of? So what climate change best practices are emerging now that we could sustain after the COVID crisis is over? And that's how the entrepreneur is thinking about it. That's on the adapt track. And the pivot track is an organization that's constantly been in the space of education, now moving to community health, because they see that their on-ground presence is very critical. They're like, can I actually start running a program in the early childcare space, which has a strong health focus, given, this reality will continue to stay on an ongoing basis. So I think those are the three types of responses that we are seeing. Again, as I said, this is guidance for today. I'm sure there are new ways people will respond to it, but it's hopefully a good way to think about what we want to do as we go forward. And again, I've classified these as activities, but I want to highlight examples as we are working on this. One is from a mitigate point of view, is to look at it from the lens of financial sustainability. Again, two of the day after the lockdown, I was on calls with three CEOs of nonprofit organizations. And what they essentially were doing is to talk to all of their donors to ensure commitments for this year and next year. They were talking about how can they repurpose their existing grants. They said, it's not possible in what we're doing. Can we do Y or Z? Because that way we continue, but make sure that we execute something different. And that's something that the two CEOs were doing literally the day after the lockdown. Similarly, I think scenario planning, I think Soumitra talked about it as well. How do you plan scenarios for 1, 2, 3? So CFOs, both in implementing and operating foundations that we are working with, and the nonprofits are making these plans to say, what should our financial estimates be? What is proven and which money do we use for what? Because I think that sort of a planning from a financial sustainability becomes critical. Second is employee well-being. And we work with a disability-based organization that was recently voted a great place to work. And one of the first things that they did, even before the lockdown was announced, was to look at their contract staff. A lot of them are staying in PGs. And PGs are very dangerous, just given the regular hygiene standards, and a lot of their staff were people with disabilities. So one of the first things that they did was to look at how can my employees who are staying in spaces that are entirely not healthy be either transported. So should there be private cars that are dropping them? What should we work with the government on? So taking a very, very proactive approach for making sure the safety of the people, either in the cities and PGs or on the ground, are taken care of. Another organization that we are working with, what they did was to look at work from home policies. So how do you, like, for example, how do you reduce the number of hours of work? Because it's a lot more stressful. And they even wrote to all of their funders and stakeholders to say, our teams are working from home, their effectiveness will be lesser. We have requested them to keep between these hours to these hours. We request you to support us as much as possible, etc., as a way of communicating how, what are the restrictions within which their employees are working in. I think that's another thing that, they've taken. Third is stakeholder communication. Again, it's extreme. Like what we said, there is, despite all the social media and everything that we are bombarded with, there is still a lack of symmetry in information in terms of what is happening in the sector. Multiple collectives are being formed, multiple funds are being started, multiple governments are asking for things, and a lot of these need-based information is still not coming through as fast and as well as we would like it to. So we have, for example, at Sattva, plugged ourselves into 30 different organizations and collectives just to be able to support such as this in the way we can add value, and also to make sure that we are able to connect across these 30 collectives that are currently working. So it would be great to establish that network. I know there is a weekly call that happens among some of the leading donors to regularly just share updates and information. So how do we create regular circles that you are part of, where you get information on a regular basis? I know that organizations here have set up their own collaboratives, especially in Mumbai. We've seen a lot of our partners and organizations we work with set up collaboratives to address specific issues, but also to regularly share information. Some of the innovators that we are working with as part of another engagement with Titan have set up a collective in Slack where they're sharing information on a regular basis. So a lot of that is happening, and how can we look at it, in an ongoing way? I think that will be critical. And the fourth mitigation, which I think for me is something that very few organizations are doing, but I was surprised when I saw that, is to recommit on planning and strategy, in certain organizations. I know of a Zoom session with a 120 member team attended, where everybody joined on Zoom to plan their overall strategy. I think funding constraints are limiting how much it is done, but most organizations are still continuing to do a robust internal planning strategy. And I think in the light of COVID, it just gives them a lot more of a reality check on what to do and how to do it. So rather than deprioritizing some of these things, which is leadership meetings, strategy workshops, etc., they're saying now it's even more important that we do this, because we need to know where we are. And interestingly, 2 days ago, an NGO reached out to me. They've been talking to us for a few months and said, can you conduct our strategy exercise now? Because we think it's now more than ever that we need that exercise, because we need to know what our options are, because our next year planning is going to become critical, and we need all the support we can get. So there is, from a mitigation point of view, these are things that we are seeing organizations doing. I mean, many organizations, especially CEOs and CFOs, looking at financial sustainability, leadership taking a very, very active role in their well-being of their employees, going beyond just work from home and making Zoom happen, to ensuring infrastructure, even internet sticks, creating a pool of internet sticks that they could use in their organization, to making sure people in unsafe environments are getting home safely, to communicating to stakeholders on employee well-being. Third is staying connected with the ecosystem to know what is going on so they can respond faster. And fourth is to double up on their organizational planning activities so that some of these things continue to happen. Yeah. So that is one, which is from a mitigation point of view. From an adapting point of view, I wanted to highlight again 4 things. One is adapting their programs. Like I said earlier, there are ways in which organizations are realizing that things that they would do normally are not, going to work because of safety of their people. So, for example, I don't know, I'm sure you followed, CRY is working with Grambani to use IVR as a way of raising awareness among people, because feet on the street is not possible today. Similarly, there is a lot of phone-based outgoing programs that are being conducted for teachers and for parents, and Meraki, which is an organization in Delhi, is now, they've brought on board Arvind Kejriwal and Manish Sisodia as well, to see if parents can be delivered messages to ensure social well-being of their children, because they were working in the early childcare space, and they're seeing now technology being a way to deliver that information. Dhwani, which is an IT company, has released a 2-page note on all the software solutions that they're bringing up and they've built that can enable nonprofits to, run some of their core operations, including data collection and so on. And some of this is already starting to happen, things that we are seeing more of, and mobile-based connectivity and phone-based research, interestingly, and I'll come to that in a bit, is, I think, very interesting. And second is aligning communication, which is, it is extremely critical, because today the mandate has come first. The strategy for most donors is coming next. So in most cases, funders have decided that they have to fund COVID, and then they're deciding what to fund in COVID. And the spectrum, of course, the first 2 weeks, we saw so much on the immediate relief part. We saw a lot of work on food. We saw kits for migrants that have stayed back in cities. We've seen mental health related grants that are coming up more often. And we are seeing information around any immediate support that can be offered. But now it's moving on to, okay, what else should we be talking about? And for me, interestingly, one of the good practices in communications was what Breakthrough did, where, they work, of course, as you know, one of the pioneering organizations in gender violence. They talked about how gender violence is more during times of lockdown, where organizations that, people staying at home, women staying at home face more violence during this time due to various reasons, and they talked about their work in gender violence and talked about how it is actually relevant. And the Skoll Open Forum that happened came in as a timely sort of a way to talk about it. And that's not something that you would immediately connect. You would not immediately connect gender violence to to COVID, but there are ways in which you can talk about it. Similarly, an education-based organization that I know talked about social emotional well-being of teachers during this time, and talked about what they are doing already with teachers and how that will be relevant. So there might not be in the donor or the ecosystem lens, an idea of how some of your current programs connect to COVID, but spending time thinking about it, thinking about the narrative that you want to hold will be useful. And one way to think about it also that we are seeing, again, organizations do, is to either look at it from your sector, which is really education's being impacted because of this. How can we include EdTech? That's a very sector lens. Second is community. You're working with a particular community like CRY is doing. We are working with XYZ communities. How can we now support them during this time? Could be one. TFI, Teach for India, has released a fundraising campaign today talking about the schools and the children that they're working with and their needs, which is really talking about the need that they're addressing. Third is capability. Are you good at something? And can you talk about that in the context of this? And I have some more examples as we go along, but Arpan, for example, a counseling organization, looking at their core capability of counseling in the time of COVID, because there is such a strong demand and a strong need for mental health, because isolation of this nature is not something we've experienced, So any which way, it could be about your sector, it could be about your community you're working with, it could be about the capability that you have. What can you do to engage the ecosystem around that? And how do you also share your learnings with the ecosystem? I think because we work with many nonprofits, we get these emails. Today, we got an email from MEDA, an organization working in Uttar Pradesh, on what are they doing about, engaging and doing things differently, which we think is very valuable, which I'm going to talk about as well. Third is adapting community engagement. It's essentially around how is your relationship with your community changing? What can you do today which can then enable them to go through this crisis effectively? And I was talking to Akanksha Foundation about that. Their engagement with the communities around education, but knowing the organization, they're one of the strongest relationships with parents, as part of their schools. Can they adapt their community engagement towards talking about COVID and COVID awareness, and how can they do that well? Could be an opportunity for them, and something that Saurabh, who's the CEO, and I discussed, something we can do. Similarly, how can you leverage community resources you've created today in a way that they can be a part of such facilities? For example, we worked on a financial inclusion program where we created women who are, digital financial inclusion experts. They have the connect to the community, they have the phone access, they have the influence. Can they now, one of the things we are exploring is to see if they can play a role to spread awareness, because the programs have created that network, and how can they make it happen? And and MEDA example again is, they're working with students and around employability. they're now creating multiple virtual formats to create engagement, ensure learning and employability, so that their programs and their engagement with their stakeholders continue to thrive during this time. I think that's another example for me of how you can look at some of these and ensure business continuity while making sure that things are ongoing overall as well. And adapting internal structure is probably something that's critical. It's not external, but internal. Organizations that, one of the largest education-based organizations that I work with, they've established a task force for COVID-related work within their organization, where somebody looks at all the work that is possible in COVID overall, and there are regular check-ins. They've also established another organized, leadership structure to look at business as usual, so that things don't go out, and we are able to look at well. The other thing that I think would be useful to do, and we are seeing this in conversations that we are having with nonprofits, is to make sure that the leadership meets more often now than less often. Yeah, because the world is changing as fast as it is, and we don't know what's going to happen post 14th or post 30th April. Maybe just meeting more often, knowing what is working, not working, and also what are we hearing, and hence what do we have to do, will be useful to from an internal adaptation sort of a point of view. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'm doing well on time, is also to talk about pivoting, which is what do you do now to ensure that there is, that you plan for this more in the mid to long term, that rather than just an immediate relief term to keep your business going. One is amplifying the current focus. We work with this organization called Jansahas that does some inspiring work with migrants, and today they released a first cut data survey around what are they hearing from migrants, and I know there are multiple initiatives that are being planned by consulting organizations and other players on collecting data on how migrants are, and for Jansahas, this is their core focus. Migrants is their current focus, but what they're able to do through partnerships, and some folks are on this call, is to actually amplify that focus by making it sharper through data, through interviews, by providing telecalling based support, and making sure that the areas that they're working in is reflected a lot sharply in terms of, not just a high level trend that you read in the newspaper, but as an actual reality that somebody can fund. I think that is one thing. The second thing that I would really urge, and I'm seeing again organizations do, is, and this is a larger trend in the sector, that we are, as nonprofit organizations, defined by the programs we run, but there is a subtle shift in terms of us being known for the capabilities that we have. And COVID is actually a great time for us to step back and think about what are our core capabilities. An organization that I'm working with has excellent network in the government. And now what they're doing is essentially saying, okay, that is my core capability. How do I make myself relevant in COVID? Because a significant funding has come down for their work. So they are now taking that capability and saying, can I enable state departments to work more effectively? Can I enable district administration to work more effectively? Can I create a structure where I can liaison between the government and other organizations, etc.? And can I create a cohesive plan and then apply for grants for this particular capability of mine? Similarly, if communications is a capability, can you leverage that now? I gave the example of Arpan earlier. It's a counseling organization that's not worked in COVID, as far as I know, but that capability being relevant now, they're able to make pivot and say, this is what I'm really good at. How can I use more of this to do this well? So I think that's another example of an organization that I think, is able to do this. There is an organization called Leap Skills, work in the employability space. They've created a dashboard today, I think the previous meeting, somebody talked about jobs. They've just created a dashboard because they're a staffing organization to say, which are the companies that are giving jobs today? Who is hiring? Because that information will be critical, because they know that capability of theirs will actually be relevant now. Third is to identify adjacencies, which, for example, we are working with an organization that works on communicable diseases in general. and they hadn't built for COVID. It's a technology-based solution, but they are pivoting themselves to say, okay, how do I make my product? How do I make my capabilities now relevant for COVID? What are the 5 or 6 things I have to add to make that this is relevant? So they're in the healthcare space. This is really where they work. Can they extend now to COVID and say that this also is something we can do, and the value that they can offer is fantastic, and now that's something that they're working on already. Similarly, organizations now community engagement, now looking at, okay, what can I do towards extending this focus despite this not being a core focus of mine. And the last is anchoring on community. And I think this is something we are seeing, and I highlighted this earlier as well. What a lot of people will have at the moment, I think when the crisis ends, is a lot of products and a lot of solutions. What they will lack is trusted people to work with communities who have deep relationships with communities. And even regular organizations that are not community-based organizations are picking a few select locations where they're working a lot deeper now. Even though they're not on the ground through calls in terms of plans, and even deeply understanding what these communities are doing, because when there is because it does 2 things. One is they really understand what is the problem today, for them to even create a strategy for pivoting. To say, okay, what is really the problem beyond everything that we are reading in the news, or somebody like me coming and talking in a webinar? Can we understand it from the community lens? And the second is they know that deep relationship that they have is a great place for them to start when there is a need for a pivot, and when new solutions have to be tried out, and where innovations have to be implemented. There will be a need for organizations that bring strong community relationships. And this is another way organizations are thinking about how they should work at look at their own work. And some of these are changes you wouldn't normally make as part of your everyday work. You wouldn't shift from education to community health. You wouldn't look at your adjacencies. You wouldn't make significant shifts. You might not go from being an organization that's fairly broad-based to community-based. But given we don't know how long this particular pandemic is going to last, and given we don't know how and what is the landscape we're going to wake up to going forward, I think it's extremely critical for us to be open about some of these opportunities that we might not have normally considered, and take very measured risks in terms of what we can do there and what we can make happen, given there be financial constraints on how far and how much we can do. So these are 3 broad categories. I know I have another 5 minutes as well. In addition to the examples I talked about verbally, also wanted to give examples of other organizations that are doing work. One aspect that we are seeing, and we talked about staying connected, is really how different organizations are connecting and working on collaboration. It could be collaboration with other city-based NGOs. There's a Bombay-based network. There's a Jaipur-based network that has emerged. There are conversations currently ongoing in Bangalore as well, in terms of how can we come together to solve actually immediate relief issues, which has been a significant focus in Mumbai. It's also been a significant focus in Gurgaon, where there's a food network that's emerged. The second is, as I talked about, how can we partner with local authorities in not just in relief, as we've listed here, but also in other aspects. The third is, how can we be connected in larger collaboratives that are being created? Swasti, for example, is an organization that's created a healthcare collaborative, looking at immediate healthcare needs a lot more holistically. And I think it's a fairly well thought through. It's a very good organization that's put that together as well. I think that's an example of how multiple organizations can come together. I know Coro and a few other organizations in Mumbai are doing the same as well, which I think is a great example of what's going on. Second, I talked about in the adapt phase, how can you use technology? So helplines, WhatsApp, technology in healthcare broadly, teleconsulting, telemedicine is one of them. And also the work like organizations like Hak Darshak are doing, really to say, how can you make technology as a way to make information available for a number of people, because they have a very strong expertise in entitlements, which is very relevant in the current times, and they want to make that available and accessible to people as well. I think that's another thing that we are seeing. Lastly, again, we talked about it. How do you leverage community structures more effectively? So look at self-help groups and how you can do there. Slums are much harder in terms of community structures. I know Samagra, which is in Pune, and Renovate India, who have been in the sanitation space, are looking at this as a way of talking about, hygiene, cleanliness, etc., which is extremely critical now. A lot of the volunteer networks, which essentially is the social sector gig economy in some sense, people that can be brought in with very different, unique skills, are now finding ways to, structure themselves, solve problems, etc. And also to look at, like the work that somebody like a Swasthya is doing, that has been working in the community side, both on the supply side, just the tribal communities, and on the demand side in the aspirational districts. Now they're extensively leveraging all of those networks to be able to see if they can empower communities to create infrastructure, other spaces, and essential services that are required for healthcare. And these are other trends that we saw, which ways to complement the core framework that we talked about. I think I'm doing good on time. Finished 3 minutes extra because I wanted to make sure that we spend enough time on questions. So if it's okay for you, and if this was helpful, it'd be great to move on to the questions now.
Thank you so much, Ratish, for such an insightful session. I'm Vanita. I am a senior consultant at Atma, and I'll be taking the Q&A section. Please keep the questions coming in the chat box that you see on your screens. We have some questions that have already come in, so I'll be reading it out to you, and you can choose to answer them during this time. So the first question is, how can Sattva play a role to connect with the thematic experts and converge for theme-based impact due to the COVID-19 and co-create programs with shared theory of change? Would Sattva be keen on this, or are you already thinking of this? This is asked by Chitra Iyer.
We are very, very open. Okay, so maybe I could just take a minute on what 4 things that we are doing. So one, like I said, we're doing Engage, which is really to make data publicly available so that we reduce information asymmetry. Happy to share, I think Atma team already has it, but happy to share a dashboard that we've put together with all the about 560 announcements that we've come across around COVID, including funding needs, funding solutions, etc., so that it can be accessible. Second is Orchestrate, which is really connecting 4 stakeholders together, which is service providers, governments, CSRs or funders and NGOs. We are doing this across 11 state governments right now. The third thing that we are doing is exactly what you said, which is to make sure that we create thematic solutions. We are working in the space of livelihoods, where we're looking at 4 thematic solutions at the moment, and we're looking at the same in healthcare as well. And we're very keen to do this around education and financial inclusion. So definitely open to already working here on this. 3, very, very open to listening to ideas and collaborating with any of you on the webinar on that. But thanks, Chitra. Thanks for the question.
Great. The next question is from Preeti, who's asking, should we reassess the projects which are currently working and stop the less important ones temporarily so that the finances can be managed properly?
For sure. I think rationalizing your portfolio, I think it will be important. You will have to look at your work, but I think a few guidelines to think about it. One will be to think about how will you decide what is important, not important, especially in the evolving times. I think will be critical. So because the way, like, for example, in an organization that I'm working with, they had a program around community awareness, which was on top of their list, but now given the situation, it's actually becoming a lot more important, So there are certain things that might become more important than less important. So create an effective framework for reassessing what you should be doing or should not be doing, number 1. And 2 is make sure that all the stakeholders are involved in that decision framework. If your funders are involved or other stakeholders or people downstream are involved, make sure that the information is done, is done effectively. And third is decide soon. I think being thorough is important, but being quick is equally important. Do not prolong these decisions. Funders have already started taking these calls, as many of us know. They've already decided which of their programs they want to continue funding, not funding, what is in, what is out, etc. So, combining speed and stability during these times is going to be very important.
Thank you for answering that. The next question is, with COVID-19 added to the Schedule 8 and many corporates struggling for a decent turnaround and profit making, what % of CSR fund decline we can see in the current fiscal year? How can organizations realign programs to support the COVID-19 and avail funds from the COVID-19 bracket?
This is one of those, let's look at the crystal ball and all gaze at it sort of a question. I mean, will there be impact? For sure. Will there be substantial impact? Most probably. Yeah. I think the following things are good to keep in mind. One is that CSR funding is an average of 3 years, and the impact of the work that we have of COVID here is really in the last quarter. So the impact that you will face immediately is still going to be lesser. I think the challenge is going to be more cash flow. I think companies might change the way they create their tranches than as much their budget. So it's cash versus cash flow. I think that's one thing to think about. Second, I think is that there are going to be some industries that are going to do well. There is a rebuilding effort. There is going to be government stimulus. So, and something that I've learned in my work in consulting is that never say anything that's true for the entire industry, which is always going to be false. But I think being really, really market focused on who is going to be at the leading edge of the rehabilitation effort or the rebuilding effort is important to think about as we think about corporate partnerships, etc. That's a second. Third is, how do we realign? Like I said, do look at, rather than just mitigating the risks, look at adapt and pivot, and given your own risk appetite as an organization, do look at your current programs and say that these are programs that can be adapted to the COVID reality. Here is the messaging, here is the story, here is your revised LFA for it, and make strategic thought through pivots. Really, this is going to be a time where you've probably went from being a type of an organization to another type of organization, as long as it's aligned to why your employees come to work every day. I think that's the other thing. The last thing I would say about this is just the nature of collaboration between government and nonprofits and companies and nonprofits will evolve during this time. And I think being open to such possibilities, working without bias, and dealing with empathy with various stakeholders during this time rather than taking sharp sides, I think will be a useful thing going forward.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that. The next question is, while we totally understand the need to adapt in the current situation, what would be the framework, format, questions that we need to address while making the shift in the programs? What kind of organizations can help us in facilitating and making such kind of shifts?
Yeah. I think personally at Sattva, we are working on this. Today, I think was a good guidance for us to stick to what other organizations are doing, because I saw what the others were sharing. I think it is a complementary thing. We would like to set up subsequent webinars on how to adapt your programs, how to mitigate and how to build and so on. I think that's something that we are putting together. And again, just the collaborative and the partners that are here, organizations like Atma in Education, just Britspan, etc., Dasra, they're fantastic organizations, and they've been working with nonprofits for a while. I think I'm sure we are all evolving our own thinking for this time. But personally from my side, I can tell you that I talked about the 4 tracks we are working on. I know I stopped at 3. The 4th track is actually this, is really in enabling nonprofits and how they can think about this. And we are looking at putting out a bunch of free resources, including webinars to checklists to material. We're putting together an idea, article, a LinkedIn blog, all of that can at least share a certain way of thinking. And again, like I said, nobody knows the clear answer, right? What we are doing at Sattva is to invite all of you to a conversation on how we can do it better and continuously share our insights as we do this.
Right. Vishwas is asking, could this crisis be a watershed moment for social sector organizations to think about moving beyond just collaboration with each other to completely merging with each other? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know what that would mean, merging with each other. I think it has two meanings. One, of course, if you think about M&A, mergers and acquisitions, I think there are a lot of people who've been wanting to see that for a long time. I don't think it'll happen. I think the capital structures in the grant-making world are actually much kinder than the for-profit world. I feel more companies will die than more non-profits. Non-profits will survive. We've learned to thrive in low resource environments for decades now. Companies haven't. So companies will die, non-profits won't, and hence the incentive to merge will still be lesser. But will this be a watershed moment? I hope so. I think I'm divided about it. I think humans are so good at reverting back to their original behaviors that I don't know if it'll really happen. But collaboration, I definitely think there's a lot more that will happen. I do think that how orchestration will happen will change. This is a longer answer, so I'll save it for now. But who will orchestrate collaboration? How will collaboration happen? I think will shift, but more collaboration for sure.
Thank you so much. That was quite an interesting take on this whole situation. Akash from Seva is asking, how can community-based organizations explore technology-based interventions, given that community is not technology friendly?
Yeah, so we work with Seva, and it's incredible what Seva has been able to do with their communities. And I think if you look at it beyond the stickers of being a community-based organization or a technology-led nonprofit or a social enterprise, I think, like I said earlier as well, I think it'll be important, and it's probably now. When Vishwas talked about watershed. I think watershed not as much on collaboration. I think a watershed moment for NGOs to start thinking of themselves as a set of capabilities rather than a set of programs has to happen. So if you ask Kaivalya Education Foundation, what are they doing? They might initially say, I do school program, district program, state program. Today, I think they will come back and say, no, my engagement is with the government. I understand technology, I understand process, So I think the question for organizations like Seva now is, it's not like you're a community-based organization. That doesn't define you. What are the capabilities that Seva should have to thrive in the future environment, and how do you build that capability? And I think that's going to be the more important question.
I hope that answers your question, Akash. Moving on to the next question, and in the interest of time, we might be taking just one or two questions more. The next question is from Shreyasi, who's asking, while making shift in focus, how can we mitigate the risks on our primary stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And Shreyasi, I think primary stakeholders come first. I think the purpose of the organization will continue to remain. And interestingly, in most cases where I am seeing organizations pivoting their choice, they keep the stakeholder constant and they're changing what they do, which is an interesting way to look at it, because they're working in communities where parents are unable to send their kids to school and the parents are starving. They're pivoting to address the parent, then shifting focus to, move to, Zambia or something, So I think it'll be useful to keep the, social purpose first. But like I said, a lot of the stickers that we associate with ourselves as an organization and the capabilities that we might want to build, etc., a lot more fluid to think of these options. But I think as people in the impact space, our commitment to our primary stakeholders continue to remain the most important.
Great. The next point is from Anisha, who's saying we are talking about mental health of employees being vital at this time, and yet cutting back on increments is the first port of call for organizations. Should we be looking at supporting our teams as, again, say, expansion, continuity plans for the year? Is this really the time to dip into the corpus, because in our sector, our people are most important asset?
Fully agree with you. I say this as a co-founder of an organization, and I say this also as somebody who's working with other organizations. At Sattva, for example, first, the principle number one is to touch our employees last. really that's the last cost we want to cut. We want to cut everything else but that. We are also actually realizing more and more that this is going to be a massive opportunity for us to ramp up our L&D and our effectiveness as a company. So we are saying that this is going to be our opportunity to learn how to thrive in less oxygen environments. So super critical to keep our employees intact, and and a lot of things that can be done there. So I agree with you. And I also know nonprofits, by the way, that are doing the same thing. There are nonprofits that are saying our employees and benefits of our employees, they're delaying some of it. Some of them are delaying, almost all organizations are delaying increments to the Q2, but they're not saying no to that. And I think as a principle, it's, I often say culture is not what you say in an offsite, right? Culture is what you do when moments like this hit you. This is really true leadership, right? When everybody is losing their heads. And I think that's really what is reflected. But personally, at a personal level, I fully align with your principle of keeping our employees first.
Great. That brings us to the last question, and quite an interesting one from Subhra, who's asking, if there is one capability that NGOs can build quickly now, what can it be?
Wow, that's a good question. That's a good question. So, one is going to be hard. I'll take all the time to think about it. Let me talk about the 5 that I think are going to be extremely important in my mind, and for different organizations, different things will apply. Number 1, I think something we do well, but I think we should continue to do well, is working and building trust with communities effectively, empowering them and not getting them dependent on us. I think that will always be the number 1 capability that any nonprofit has to build, is are you enabling empowered communities, unlocking potential, rather than getting people dependent on you or provisioning solutions without building capability. I think number 1. Number 2, I think in this current time, your ability to use data and your ability to use technology, I think is going to be definitely important. There are going to be, like, I'm learning to facilitate workshops with 20 organizations on Zoom. It is for me a personal learning. It's just extremely, I find it very, very hard. And similarly, and that is much easier than imagine working with communities without being there on the ground and finding new ways of using technology, data to know how do you engage, where do you engage, how effective is your engagement today, etc. And I think that's going to be the second sort of thing that is going to be important. Third, I think, is going to be program design. Really strong outcome-based program design where you are able to cut this is what I want to do to what do we want to get done, and can you work backwards in making that happen, I think is going to be the third sort of capability that I think is going to be important, because your program designs are going to shift and shift fast. And without program designs, you can't raise money. So I think just training or empowering their entire organizations to think about program design effectively is going to be very, very critical. I think that's number 1. The number 3. The 4th is building win-win partnerships. It's very hard, because it's the way capital is structured in the social sector, right? The fault is not with nonprofits. It's the way the ecosystem works, but finding ways to create win-win opportunities, co-bid, having 2 leaders on top of these 2 organizations who can deal with egos, right? I think that's all collaboration really needs. But then, and creating that middle management that is able to work with each other. I think that is going to be important, to make happen at this time, because I feel like nobody, given how new this problem is, no one organization has a solution to solve this problem. That at least all of us can acknowledge, which means most of us have to work together, which means we have to collaborate. So how do we do that better, I think is going to be important. And the last thing, and I always save it for the last, is fundraising. You will have to raise money, and it's always going to be important. The sector is starved of good fundraisers. So I think building on our skills, building relationships with various funders, creating different ways of looking at money and what type of money we want, I think is going to be important. I think those are my top 5. Number 1 out of this, yeah, that's hard, but probably data and technology and program design are probably the first of equals.
Thank you so much, Ratish. This was extremely, it was a pleasure speaking to you and hearing all your thoughts around this matter. I'm going to pass on the mic to Sneha, and she'll take you through the next session.
Hi, everybody. I just want to start out saying that, Ratish, I think your session has been really engaging and almost filled with so many, sort of things one can do, so many learnings that I'm struggling to summarize just a few of them. But I'm going to call out a few that really stood out for me. I think something you said right at the beginning of the presentation, that the greatest strength for an organization is going to be agility. And the ability to sort of learn from each other, and this in the context of the fact that none of us, or most of us at least, have never been through a crisis like this, and so this is probably the most important skill set to have at the moment. Mitigating through organizational planning is also important, more so now than before. I think we don't often think about the internal planning and the leadership needs and conversations that need to be happening at a time like this. And even though in the time of physical distancing, this is going to be super critical or a make or break for a lot of organizations. Amongst adapting, I really like what you said about not having feet of ground. A large percentage of nonprofits rely heavily on the communities and on the feet on ground that do the work for them in those communities, and so how does one operate without those is going to be something that one has to think through. Among the points on pivoting, I really like what you said about identifying core capabilities, and not so much thinking about what you do as an organization, as what you are good at, and what sort of capability or skill can you bring to the table and possibly change what you do, but stay true to that. Being open to new opportunities, taking measured risks, and of course, keeping the primary stakeholder constant. So, those for me were some of the key sort of takeaways and really, really powerful thoughts from your session. So thank you so much, Ratish, for hosting this for us. We will now be